I want to talk about the news pyramid. The news pyramid, well, I'll talk about all story formats, but the news pyramid is probably the most dominant of the formats. And the pyramid is, I mean, a pyramid, you're all familiar with, pyramid, a triangular building, obviously. And with a pyramid, you always put the kind of the biggest blocks, the biggest stones at the bottom, as you would with anything you were building, kind of like that. You wouldn't put big rocks at the top of a structure, you'd put them at the bottom. So an inverted pyramid is just the idea of you invert it, you turn it upside down, but you put the biggest rocks at the top, and as you get down towards the bottom, you put the smallest rocks. So it's just the idea, it's kind of a visual idea of, a story should start with the strongest information, the strongest rocks, the strongest stones, whatever you want to say. And so the question is okay, that makes sense. The idea is, if you get a newspaper or, you're online and you're looking in the morning at news, there's hundreds of articles you could read. Here's just a few sections of the, Sunday Chicago Tribune. There's just a few sections here just on my table. And this isn't even the full paper. And there's probably at least, 30 pages. Each page probably has at least a couple stories. I mean, that's 60 stories. Each story is probably 1,000 words because they're more featurey. That's a novel right there just in my hand. That's not even the whole book. It's maybe not quite that much. I might have overestimated that a little bit. But the whole Chicago Tribune, the whole New York Times, any of these definitely are longer than novels on a Sunday. And the whole thing, not just sections. And so the thing is most people, when they read, they look at the headline, they may read the first couple paragraphs. Most people don't read entire stories. Now, some do, and I mean, I would say that I probably, stories I finish maybe a quarter or third of them, and I'm well above average on finishing stories with that percentage. But I mean, I probably read half of the stories or more, 60% of the time, 70% of the time. But the reality is people quit reading at some point. And that's a combination of just, not engaging, less interesting information. But the other thing is just time. I don't have time to read every story. And if things aren't interesting to me, I move on to the next story. There's enough reading that I could, if I read every word, it would take me hours to do, to get through the news. And I don't have that kind of time. So the idea is you want to put the top information. Now, where did this come from? Well, the idea of the news pyramid came about, it actually came about during the Civil War time, maybe a little bit before that. But the basic idea is it was kind of when the telegraph came along. And the telegraph, what would happen is you would have a reporter, they were down in maybe the South following along, and they were going to do a story about a battle that had occurred. And they got the story written, and they would take it to the telegraph operator who would then relay it. Well, the problem with the telegraph is a fewfold. First of all, a telegraph, you don't necessarily get a direct link all the way back to your office in Washington, D.C. or New York to give the news. So you have to relay it. And so maybe they would take it from, Roanoke up to Charlottesville, and then Charlottesville up to, Philadelphia, and then Philadelphia to New York or something. I don't know, I wouldn't know how it would work. But so what happens is maybe you get the full story on to Roanoke or onto Charlottesville or whichever one I said, I don't know. And you get part of the story on up, but then the next person would run into a problem where the person in Philadelphia said, I only got 5 minutes. I got another wire coming through. I got to get to, or I'm getting interrupted, because the War Department or the president wants to send a message and I got to cut it off. And so sometimes those messages would get cut off. Well, if you're sending a story and you don't get down to the number of people dead until, halfway through the story, you start off with how the smoke was wafting and the fields were set with dew, and you do a kind of a scene setter lead, that's wonderful, but you're not getting to the news. Reading this story in New York are going to learn all about the wonderful, scene and how the dew hung heavy in the fields and all that, and have no clue that anybody died. So what happens is is they realize we have to write these stories where we put the big information up at the top. That way, if the whole story doesn't get through, they at least get the important facts. And so what would happen is you think about the story of what's the most important thing. If I only had 2 minutes to tell my story, what would I tell? And it may not be the fun little story or some of the fun, interesting things, but it may have other things. Now, sometimes if I'm telling a story, I might actually put in some fun little interesting fact before I give all the, other facts that are more important, that are maybe more, not more important, but they're more factual, more just details that maybe I wouldn't if I didn't have a fun little story to put in there. But by and large, you want to get out the information about how many people are dead, when the battle began, where the troops moved on to, who is victorious, these types of things. And so that's kind of where that comes about. And so the other thing that comes about from this is stories start off with the most important information, and then they kind of chunk it along. They don't tell a story of one soldier before they have all that out. But they also become very chunk driven, which is why when you read a newspaper or a news story, they usually have very short paragraphs. There's usually there's a little bit of a joke of what is a paragraph. How do journalists define a paragraph? And it's a sentence that is indented is kind of the joke. The idea is a lot of times you read a newspaper or a magazine, or not necessarily a magazine, but or online, and a lot of times you have one sentence paragraph after one sentence paragraph. And the reason is a couple-fold. But one reason is that, is people like these small chunks. It gives them a point to stop. They realize, hey, it's just one more paragraph. I can read one more. If you're looking at your screen on your phone even, and you're kind of scrolling, if you have a long chunk that the entire screen is one paragraph, that is very not enticing, right? But if you have 3 or 4 paragraphs, you might keep scrolling and scrolling. You'll scroll longer is what the research shows. And so if you want people to read more, you actually chunk it up into small bits. But the other reason they do it is when you change, like if you say 1,800 people were killed, and then you want to just talk about, one aspect or another little fact or another little fact, you just start a new paragraph. You don't have to use a lot of transition. You just start a new paragraph. You talk about something different. You start a new paragraph. You talk about something different. And so everything's kind of put in these little chunks. And so that's part of why it's written that way. Now, that style of writing is not necessarily as important because we no longer have that same limitation based upon the wire, but it is still the case that we use that to a certain degree. We aren't necessarily as chunk driven, but we try to kind of weave the stories together a little bit better. But as far as it goes, I mean, that was the style, and the reason is because people, they would just kind of jump chunk to chunk to chunk, and there was no need really for transition or anything. So that's the news pyramid. That's why we write that way. And so don't be afraid just to kind of start a new paragraph and start a new fact and do that type of thing. Now, the other thing I was going to say is I did talk about that, but you also have this handout on page, I believe it's page 7 of the 10 pages of this handout I gave you, the PDF a couple weeks ago. It talks about how to format a story. Now, the news pyramid is kind of your classic example. And in that case, it talks about how, your lead is important, but the next paragraph is equally important. That's where you flesh it out. You draw the reader in even more. And then you begin to maybe give a quote, and then maybe fact, quote, fact, fact, that kind of thing. Recent developments, what's next. So you kind of just build that kind of format. But the inverted pyramid is on page 8 of that handout. It talks about the inverted pyramid. And it says, you start off with, most important facts, other key facts, more facts, and so on until you've given in the story. But there are a couple other styles, and I just want to kind of briefly talk about those other styles. This handout is very important. I would read through it, but I just want to bring up that there are 2 other styles that are common, and one of them is called the martini glass. The martini glass, I think, is most commonly used in obituaries, but it's also in any kind of biography and other things. And a martini glass is, if you have a martini glass, you know what that looks like. It's kind of a big triangular cup at the top, and then a long straight stem, and then kind of like a wine glass fluted out at the bottom, or where, kind of comes out, or whatever you might call it, and in order to sit. And that's the same as a martini, but a martini has a distinctive triangular shape, and so it works well because the martini glass usually starts with a small inverted pyramid, most important information, and then it gets down to a point where it kind of gives just a chronological. It kind of just gives you the details. Nothing really is more important. The reason it's a straight, kind of that stem of that glass is because it's not really anything more important. It's just chronological. It's just factual. It's just orderly. There's no real hierarchy within it. The top is hierarchy. It's saying this is most important. This is most important. This is more important. This is, and then it finally gets to the point where it feels like the importance is no longer there. It gives you chronological or details kind of in just a set pattern, no real significance to it. And then at the bottom, it flutes out, or I don't know if that's the right word, but it fans out. And usually they just call that the kicker. It's something that kind of pulls the story back together, gives you something important. It breaks from that chronological and kind of comes back and gives you just some meat there at the end to kind of hold up the whole story. And that's the martini glass. Like I said, obituaries are a commonplace. It may also be the case that if you covered a meeting where there was a really big discussion going on, you might start off with kind of that, 80 people filled the place, the tension and blah, blah, blah. And this person said this and this person said that and whatever. And then you come down, you give kind of, here's the way the meeting went, unfolded. And then you come back and you give some good quote or something at the end to kick it out and hold up the whole story. The other is the kebab. Now the kebab is just like a shish kebab, where it's, a stick with meat plugged along it. And what they usually do is a kebab is a form where it's kind of like you chunk your story together, where there's no real hierarchy of this is most important. Usually you start off with an anecdote, a little story, something sweet to entice people. Then you get to your nut graph, kind of why this is a story. And then you kind of just go through sections of the story, like little nuggets of meat. And you maybe stick in some little pieces of vegetable between it, kind of thing. Just, there's no, there's no hierarchy within it. It's just telling a story. And so this is oftentimes done with maybe a more featurey, a longer form about something important where, it's about, some issue in your community, changing education, reforming things, building bridges, whatever. And you may start off with a story about, some kind of interesting story, an anecdote. You come into the nut graph, why this is a story, and then maybe you give different aspects and you kind of break it up. And usually at the end, the only difference is when you lead with an anecdote, there's a general rule. You should always return to that anecdote at the end. You should bookend your story. So if you start off with Billy and what he's doing, you really should return to Billy at the end. That's kind of the ideal. It kind of connects the beginning and the end and kind of just has these little chunks in the middle. And the idea there is you could read a little vignette, you could do a subhead, and they could read that, and then you could read the next one. You could skip one and you'd still have the main story. And usually as you transition between them, you give kind of a little bit of that nut graphy, kind of tying one chunk to the next. It's not hierarchical. It's not pyramid. It's not, this is more important. It's just, here's a story. This is why it's important. And then we're going to take aspects like maybe the science or maybe the politics or maybe this person's experience. And you just kind of chunk it together and tie it together in the little gaps between those stories. So those are your main types, and that's about it.